You move through your day making decisions, and most of them feel like your own. You choose what to say, how to respond, where to direct your attention. But beneath the surface of these choices, there is often something else at work. Something quieter. Something you may not have fully noticed yet. Hello and welcome back. Today's topic is how to stop caring what others think. Before we get to the video, quickly subscribe to the channel and hit the like button for audiobook videos like this. If you're ready, let's get to the video. Chapter 1: The Invisible Prison of Approval. It is the need to be seen in a certain way. Not always loud. Not always obvious. But present. Shaping your words before you speak them. Adjusting your behavior before you act. Pulling you toward what feels safe, what feels acceptable, what feels like it will land well with others. This is not about being polite or considerate. Those are conscious choices. This is different. This is the quiet pressure that lives beneath your decisions, the part of you that hesitates before speaking, that edits your thoughts before sharing them, that reconsiders your preferences based on how they might be received. You may not notice it at first. Most people don't. It operates beneath the surface of awareness, shaping choices in small, seemingly insignificant ways. What you say in a conversation. How you present yourself online. The opinions you share. The ones you keep to yourself. The way you dress. The things you laugh at. The things you pretend not to care about. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It simply becomes the lens through which you interpret your own actions. And over time, without realizing it, you begin to live according to a set of invisible rules that were never truly yours. This is not about politeness or social awareness. Those have their place. This is about something deeper. It's about the quiet erosion of your own internal reference point. The slow replacement of your sense of direction with a constant need to check how others are reacting. You stop asking yourself what you actually think. You stop noticing what you actually feel. Instead, you begin to scan. You measure. You interpret facial expressions, tone of voice, the slight delay in a response. You search for signs of approval or disapproval, and you adjust accordingly. This happens so gradually that you don't even notice it's happening. At first, it feels like social awareness. It feels like empathy. It feels like being considerate. But over time, it becomes something else. It becomes a reflex. A need. A silent pressure that sits in the background of every choice you make. You stop asking yourself what you actually want. You start asking what others might think. And that shift, small as it seems, changes everything. This is not about caring what people think in healthy ways. It's about losing your own internal compass because the external one feels safer. It's about making decisions not based on your values, but on how you imagine those decisions will be received. And the cruelest part is that most people don't even notice it's happening. They believe they're making their own choices. They believe they're living according to their own values. But quietly, beneath the surface, there's a constant scan running in the background, a mental check that asks, what will they think? That question, repeated enough times, becomes invisible. It stops feeling like a question. It starts feeling like instinct. And that's when the prison becomes complete. Not because someone locked you in, but because you began building the walls yourself. Without even knowing it. You can trace this pattern back if you pay attention. There are moments throughout your day when it becomes visible. Small moments. Brief flashes where you catch yourself adjusting. You're about to say something in a group conversation, and you pause. Not because you've lost your train of thought. Not because the moment isn't right. But because something in you is checking. Calculating. Wondering how it will be received. You change your mind about what to wear, not because the first choice felt wrong to you, but because you imagined how someone else might see it. You laugh at something you don't find funny because everyone else is laughing. You agree with an opinion you don't hold because disagreeing feels like too much effort, too much exposure, too much risk. These are small things. Tiny adjustments. Barely noticeable in the moment. But they add up. Over time, these small moments of adjustment become the norm. They stop feeling like compromises. They start feeling like just how things are. And you begin to lose touch with what you actually think, what you actually want, what you actually value. The need for approval doesn't always look like desperation. It doesn't always look like someone begging to be liked. Often, it's far more subtle than that. It looks like caution. It looks like restraint. It looks like someone who is careful with their words, thoughtful about their choices, measured in their responses. And on the surface, that might even seem admirable. But underneath, there's a difference between being thoughtful and being controlled by the opinions of others. There's a difference between choosing your words carefully because you value clarity, and choosing them carefully because you're afraid of being judged. One comes from self-awareness. The other comes from fear. And the fear is not always obvious. It doesn't always feel like fear. Sometimes it just feels like common sense. Like the smart thing to do. Like the way a mature person navigates the world. But if you look closer, you may begin to notice that this so-called maturity is actually a form of self-suppression. A constant editing of your natural responses. A habitual checking and rechecking of how you're being perceived. And the exhausting part is that it never really ends. Because approval, when you're chasing it, is not something you ever fully secure. It's not a finish line you cross. It's a moving target. A constant negotiation. A performance that requires endless maintenance. You say the right thing today, and tomorrow you have to say it again. You present yourself in a certain way this week, and next week you have to maintain that image. You win someone's approval in one conversation, and in the next, you have to earn it all over again. There's no rest in this pattern. No moment where you can simply be. Because the need for approval is not actually about other people. It's about the story you're telling yourself about what their approval means. You believe, on some level, that if they approve of you, then you're safe. Then you're acceptable. Then you have value. And if they don't approve, then something is wrong. Then you've failed. Then you're at risk. This is where the prison becomes invisible. Because from the inside, it doesn't feel like a prison at all. It feels like survival. It feels like the only reasonable way to navigate a world full of judgment and expectation. But what you may not realize is that this constant scanning for approval is not protecting you. It's limiting you. It's limiting your ability to speak honestly. To make choices that reflect what you actually value. To build relationships based on who you really are, rather than who you think you need to be. And over time, the distance between who you are and who you're pretending to be becomes so wide that you forget where the line is. You forget what you actually think because you've spent so long thinking about what others think. You forget what you actually want because you've spent so long adjusting to what seems acceptable. You forget what your own voice sounds like because you've spent so long shaping it to fit the room. And this is not something that happens all at once. It's not a single moment of surrender. It's a gradual drift. A slow erosion. A series of small compromises that, individually, seem harmless. But together, they create a life that feels like it's being lived at a distance. Like you're watching yourself from the outside, performing a role that was never quite yours. This is the invisible prison. Not built by others. Built by the quiet, constant need to be seen in a certain way. Built by the belief that approval is something you must earn, maintain, and protect at all costs. And the tragedy is that most people don't realize they're inside it. They think they're free. They think they're making their own choices. They think they're living authentically. But if you pause and pay attention, you may begin to notice the signs. The hesitation before you speak. The mental rehearsal before you share an opinion. The subtle adjustment of your behavior based on who's in the room. The way you feel lighter around some people and heavier around others, not because of them, but because of how much effort it takes to maintain the version of yourself you present to them. These are not signs of weakness. They're signs of a pattern. A pattern that most people carry without ever examining it. And the first step in breaking free from this pattern is simply noticing that it exists. Not judging it. Not fighting it. Just noticing it. Because once you see it, you can begin to understand it. And once you understand it, you can begin to question it. You can begin to ask yourself why you hesitate. Why you adjust. Why you scan the room for approval before deciding what to say or do. And you may begin to realize that the approval you're seeking is not actually the thing you need. What you need is not to be liked by everyone. What you need is to stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying to be liked. What you need is not external validation. What you need is the ability to trust your own sense of what's right, what's true, what's worth saying or doing, regardless of how it's received. This is not about becoming indifferent to others. It's not about rejecting feedback or isolating yourself. It's about reclaiming your internal reference point. It's about rebuilding the part of you that knows what you think, what you feel, what you value, without needing permission from the outside world to believe it. And this process begins with awareness. With noticing the moments when you adjust. When you edit. When you scan for approval. Not to criticize yourself for doing it, but simply to see it clearly. Because the invisible prison only remains a prison as long as it stays invisible. The moment you see it, the walls begin to lose their power. You begin to realize that you've been living according to rules that were never yours. That you've been performing for an audience that may not even care as much as you think they do. And slowly, you begin to ask yourself a different question. Not, what will they think? But what do I actually think? That question, quiet as it is, changes everything. It redirects your attention inward. It asks you to check in with yourself before checking in with everyone else. It asks you to notice what you feel before deciding how to present it. And at first, this may feel uncomfortable. Because you've spent so long looking outward for guidance that looking inward can feel disorienting. Like standing in a room you haven't entered in years. The furniture is still there, but it's covered in dust. The lights still work, but you're not sure where the switch is. You're not used to trusting your own judgment without external confirmation. You're not used to making decisions without mentally running them past an imagined audience first. You're not used to simply knowing what you think, without needing someone else to validate it. But this discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that you're beginning to shift. That you're beginning to reclaim something that was always yours but got buried under years of adjustment and performance. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. You begin to notice that your opinion doesn't need to be popular to be valid. That your preferences don't need to be shared by others to be legitimate. That your choices don't need to be applauded to be right for you. You begin to notice that the people whose approval you've been chasing may not even be people whose opinions you genuinely respect. You begin to notice that the version of yourself you've been presenting is not necessarily the version that feels most true. And slowly, you begin to let go of the need to control how you're perceived. Not because you stop caring entirely, but because you realize that controlling perception is not actually possible. People will think what they think. They will interpret you through their own filters, their own experiences, their own biases. And no amount of adjustment on your part will change that. You can say the perfect thing, and someone will still misunderstand you. You can present yourself flawlessly, and someone will still find fault. You can bend yourself into the shape you think they want, and they still may not approve. Because approval is not something you earn through performance. It's something that either exists or doesn't, based on factors largely outside your control. And once you see this clearly, the whole game starts to feel pointless. Not in a nihilistic way, but in a liberating way. You realize that if approval is not guaranteed no matter how hard you try, then there's no point in sacrificing yourself to chase it. You realize that the energy you've been spending on scanning, adjusting, and performing could be redirected towards something far more valuable, living in alignment with what you actually believe. And this is where the shift begins to feel real. Not dramatic. Not sudden. But steady. You stop editing yourself as much. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop checking the room before deciding what to say. You start speaking from a place of clarity rather than caution. You start making choices based on what feels right to you, rather than what feels safe. You start noticing that the people who matter don't need you to perform. And the people who need you to perform don't actually matter. This doesn't mean you become reckless. It doesn't mean you stop considering others. It just means you stop abandoning yourself in the process. You stop treating your own perspective as less important than everyone else's. You stop assuming that their judgment is more accurate than your own sense of what's true. You stop giving away your power to people who never asked for it and don't know what to do with it. And over time, this becomes your new baseline. Not perfection. Not complete freedom from the need for approval. But a steady, grounded sense of self that doesn't collapse every time someone disagrees with you or doesn't respond the way you hoped they would. You become less reactive. Less dependent. Less concerned with maintaining an image that was never truly yours to begin with. And in that space, something else begins to emerge. A quiet confidence. Not loud. Not performative. Just steady. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are, what you value, and what you're willing to stand for. Even when no one is watching. Even when no one approves. Even when you're the only one in the room who sees things the way you do. This is not about being right. It's about being real. And being real, it turns out, is far more valuable than being liked. Because when you're real, the approval you do receive actually means something. It's not based on a performance. It's based on who you actually are. And the disapproval you receive loses its power. Because it's not aimed at you. It's aimed at a version of you that someone imagined. A version that may have nothing to do with who you actually are. So you let it pass. You let people think what they think. You let their opinions exist without needing to control them, correct them, or collapse under the weight of them. And in doing so, you step out of the invisible prison. Not by fighting your way out. Not by declaring independence in some grand, dramatic gesture. But by simply noticing that the door was never really locked. That the walls were built from habits, not stone. That the prison was maintained by belief, not force. And the moment you stop believing in it, it begins to fade. Slowly. Quietly. Steadily. Until one day, you realize you're no longer checking for approval before you speak. You're just speaking. And that, more than anything, is what freedom feels like. Chapter 2: Why Judgment Feels So Powerful. There is a reason judgment feels the way it does. A reason it can stop you mid-sentence, shift your posture, change the course of your day. It's not random. It's not irrational. It's wired into you at a level deeper than conscious thought. Your brain treats social rejection the same way it treats physical danger. Not metaphorically. Literally. The same neural pathways that fire when you're in physical pain light up when you experience social exclusion. The same systems that evolved to keep you safe from predators now respond to disapproval, criticism, or the sense that you've been judged negatively. This is not a flaw in your design. It's a feature. For most of human history, being excluded from the group meant death. It meant losing access to resources, protection, shelter. It meant being alone in a world that did not tolerate solitude well. So your ancestors who cared deeply about what others thought, who adjusted their behavior to stay in the group's good graces, were the ones who survived. And you inherited that sensitivity. You inherited a brain that treats social threat as survival threat. And even though the world has changed, even though being disliked no longer means being left to die in the wilderness, your brain hasn't fully caught up. It still scans for signs of rejection. It still interprets criticism as danger. It still responds to judgment with the kind of intensity that feels disproportionate to the actual situation. Because to your nervous system, it's not disproportionate. It's survival. This is why a single negative comment can overshadow a dozen positive ones. Why one moment of perceived judgment can linger for days. Why the fear of being criticized can stop you from speaking up, even when you know you have something worth saying. Your brain is not overreacting. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's trying to keep you safe. But in the process, it's also keeping you small. Because the world you live in now is not the world your brain was built for. You're no longer dependent on a small tribe for survival. You're no longer at risk of being cast out into a hostile environment with no way to fend for yourself. But your brain doesn't know that. It still operates as if rejection equals death. As if disapproval equals danger. As if being judged means you're no longer safe. And so you respond accordingly. You adjust. You perform. You scan the room for signs of how you're being received, and you course correct based on what you find. This happens faster than you can think. It happens before you're even aware it's happening. Someone raises an eyebrow, and you second guess what you just said. Someone doesn't laugh at your joke, and you decide you're not funny. Someone seems distracted during your conversation, and you assume you're boring them. These interpretations happen in milliseconds. And they feel true. They feel like facts. But they're not facts. They're assumptions. And those assumptions are being generated by a system that's trying to protect you from a threat that no longer exists in the way it once did. This is not to say that social feedback doesn't matter. It does. But the intensity with which your brain responds to it is often out of proportion to the actual risk involved. You're not going to die if someone doesn't like what you said. You're not going to be cast out if someone disagrees with you. You're not going to lose everything if someone judges you negatively. But your nervous system doesn't always know that. And so it treats these moments as if they carry the weight of life and death. And this is where the pattern begins to take root. Because when judgment feels this powerful, the natural response is to avoid it. To minimize the risk of triggering it. To adjust your behavior in ways that reduce the likelihood of being judged negatively. And on the surface, this seems reasonable. It seems like the smart thing to do. But over time, it becomes a trap. Because the more you adjust to avoid judgment, the more sensitive you become to it. The more you scan for signs of disapproval, the more you find them. The more you try to control how you're perceived, the more you realize you can't. And the cycle continues. Your brain's sensitivity to judgment is not something you can simply turn off. It's not something you can logic your way out of. It's a deeply embedded response that has been reinforced over thousands of generations. But what you can do is begin to see it for what it is. Not a reflection of reality. But a reflection of your brain's attempt to keep you safe in a world that no longer requires this level of vigilance. And once you see this, the intensity begins to shift. Not immediately. Not all at once. But gradually. You begin to notice when your brain is generating a threat response to something that's not actually threatening. You begin to recognize when your nervous system is reacting to judgment as if it's danger, even when the actual consequences are minimal. And in those moments, you can pause. You can breathe. You can remind yourself that the intensity you're feeling is not a reflection of the actual risk involved. This doesn't make the feeling go away. But it does create space between the feeling and your response to it. And in that space, you begin to reclaim some control. Not control over whether people judge you. That's not within your power. But control over how much weight you give to that judgment. Control over whether you let it dictate your choices, your words, your sense of self. Because here's the thing most people don't realize: judgment is always happening. People are always forming opinions. Always interpreting. Always making assumptions. But most of the time, those judgments have far less weight than you think they do. Most of the time, people are not thinking about you as much as you imagine they are. This is not meant to be dismissive. It's meant to be clarifying. Because when you're caught in the grip of worrying about what others think, it feels like you're the center of their attention. Like they're scrutinizing every word you say, every choice you make, every detail of how you present yourself. But the reality is that most people are too busy thinking about themselves to spend much time thinking about you. They're worried about their own performance, their own image, their own fear of being judged. They're running the same scan you're running, checking for signs of approval or disapproval, adjusting their behavior based on what they think others think. And in the process, they're barely registering half of what you're doing. This doesn't mean they don't notice you at all. It just means that the version of you they're noticing is filtered through their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own interpretations. And those interpretations often have more to do with them than with you. Someone interprets your silence as arrogance, when really you were just thinking. Someone interprets your confidence as aggression, when really you were just speaking clearly. Someone interprets your kindness as weakness, when really you were just being considerate. These interpretations happen constantly. And they're largely out of your control. Because people don't see you as you are. They see you through the lens of their own experience, their own fears, their own assumptions about how the world works. And no amount of adjustment on your part will change that. You can try to present yourself in a way that minimizes misinterpretation. You can choose your words carefully. You can modulate your tone. You can manage your body language. But at the end of the day, people will still interpret you through their own filters. And some of those interpretations will be inaccurate. Some will be unfair. Some will have nothing to do with who you actually are. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. Because if people are going to judge you anyway, and if those judgments are filtered through their own biases and insecurities, then what exactly are you trying to control? You can't control what they think. You can't control how they interpret you. You can't control whether they approve or disapprove. All you can control is whether you abandon yourself in the process of trying to manage their perception. And most of the time, without realizing it, that's exactly what you're doing. You're adjusting. You're performing. You're shaping yourself into something you think will be more acceptable, more palatable, more likely to avoid judgment. But in doing so, you're reinforcing the very pattern that keeps you trapped. Because the more you adjust, the more you lose touch with what you actually think and feel. And the more you lose touch with yourself, the more dependent you become on external validation to tell you who you are. And this dependency is exhausting. Because external validation is inconsistent. It's unreliable. It shifts based on mood, context, timing. What one person approves of, another criticizes. What works in one situation backfires in another. And so you're constantly recalibrating. Constantly adjusting. Constantly trying to hit a moving target that you never quite reach. And all the while, your brain is interpreting this as confirmation that the threat is real. That judgment is dangerous. That you need to keep scanning, keep adjusting, keep performing. But the truth is, the threat is not as real as it feels. The intensity is real. The discomfort is real. The nervous system response is real. But the actual danger, the risk of being cast out, of losing everything, of not surviving, is not there. And when you begin to see this, something starts to shift. You begin to notice that you can be judged and still be okay. That you can be criticized and still have value. That you can be misunderstood and still know who you are. You begin to notice that the catastrophic outcomes your brain is preparing for rarely, if ever, actually happen. Someone disapproves of you, and your life continues. Someone criticizes you, and you're still standing. Someone misinterprets you, and the world doesn't end. And over time, these small realizations begin to weaken the grip that judgment has on you. Not because you stop caring entirely, but because you stop treating it like a life or death situation. You stop giving it more power than it actually has. You stop assuming that every moment of disapproval is a referendum on your worth. You stop interpreting every raised eyebrow, every moment of silence, every lack of enthusiastic response as evidence that you failed. And in the space that opens up, you begin to think more clearly. You begin to ask better questions. Not what will they think, but what do I think? Not how can I avoid being judged, but what's worth doing even if I am judged? Not how can I make everyone approve of me, but who do I actually want to be? These questions don't eliminate the discomfort of judgment, but they shift your relationship to it. They remind you that judgment is not the enemy. It's just information. Sometimes useful. Often inaccurate. Always filtered through someone else's perspective. And when you see it as information rather than threat, you can engage with it differently. You can consider it without collapsing under it. You can reflect on it without letting it define you. You can learn from it without assuming it's the ultimate truth about who you are. And this shift, subtle as it is, changes everything. Because it means you're no longer at the mercy of other people's opinions. You're no longer waiting for approval to feel okay about yourself. You're no longer scanning the room for validation before deciding what to say or do. You're operating from a different place. A steadier place. A place that doesn't require constant external confirmation to remain intact. And this is not about becoming arrogant or dismissive of feedback. It's about building a foundation that doesn't crumble every time someone disagrees with you. It's about recognizing that your worth is not determined by whether people approve of you in any given moment. It's about understanding that your brain's response to judgment is a survival mechanism from another time, and that while you can't eliminate it, you don't have to let it run your life. You can feel the discomfort and still speak up. You can notice the fear and still make the choice that aligns with who you are. You can be judged and still stand by what you believe. Not because you're immune to judgment, but because you've learned to see it clearly. You've learned to distinguish between the intensity of the feeling and the reality of the situation. You've learned that your brain's alarm system is sensitive, but not always accurate. And you've learned that the story your mind tells you about what judgment means is just that, a story. Not a fact. Not a prophecy. Not the final word on who you are or what you're capable of. Just a story. Generated by a system that's trying to protect you, but also, in its overprotection, limiting you. And the moment you see that story for what it is, you begin to write a different one. Not a story about being liked by everyone. Not a story about avoiding judgment at all costs. But a story about living in alignment with what you value, even when that means being misunderstood. A story about speaking your truth, even when it's not popular. A story about building a life that feels real, rather than one that just looks acceptable. And this story, quiet and steady as it is the one worth telling. Because it's not shaped by fear. It's shaped by clarity. It's not driven by the need to avoid judgment. It's driven by the desire to live honestly. And that shift, from fear to clarity, from avoidance to honesty, is what begins to set you free. Not free from judgment. That's not possible. But free from the belief that judgment has the power to define you. Free from the need to constantly adjust, perform, and scan for approval. Free to simply be. And to trust that being yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, is enough. This is the foundation. This is where the work begins. Not in some distant future where you've conquered all fear and become impervious to judgment. But here. Now. In this moment. In the simple act of seeing your patterns clearly and choosing, even just once, to respond differently. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes the path forward. Chapter 3: The Cost of Caring Too Much. There is a price to caring what everyone thinks. It's not always obvious at first. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up as a single catastrophic event. It accumulates slowly, quietly, over time. And by the time you notice it, the damage has already been done. Not irreversible damage. But damage nonetheless. The kind that shows up in the way you hesitate before speaking. The way you second guess your own preferences. The way you feel exhausted after social interactions, not because they were difficult, but because you spent the entire time managing how you were being perceived. This exhaustion is not laziness. It's not weakness. It's the natural result of living in a constant state of performance. Because when you're always adjusting to fit what you think others want, you're never really resting. You're never really being. You're always scanning, calculating, measuring. Always one step removed from the present moment because part of your attention is elsewhere, monitoring reactions, gauging responses, checking for signs of approval or disapproval. And this split attention takes a toll. It takes a toll on your energy, on your clarity, on your sense of self. Because the more you adjust to please others, the less you know what you actually want. The more you suppress your real thoughts to avoid conflict, the less access you have to those thoughts when you need them. The more you shape yourself to fit different contexts, the harder it becomes to remember what shape you were before you started bending. And over time, this creates a kind of internal dissonance. A gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be. At first, the gap is small. Barely noticeable. You tell a small lie to avoid an awkward conversation. You agree with an opinion you don't hold because it's easier than explaining your actual view. You laugh at something you don't find funny because everyone else is laughing. These moments feel harmless in isolation. And maybe they are. But they add up. Each time you suppress what you really think, you reinforce the habit of suppression. Each time you adjust your behavior to avoid judgment, you strengthen the belief that your natural self is not acceptable. Each time you prioritize someone else's comfort over your own honesty, you send yourself a message: your truth is less important than their approval. And that message, repeated over months and years, becomes part of how you see yourself. You begin to believe that who you really are is not enough. That your thoughts need to be filtered. That your preferences need to be justified. That your presence needs to be softened, adjusted, made more palatable. And this belief erodes something essential. It erodes your confidence. Not the loud, performative kind of confidence. But the quiet, steady kind. The kind that comes from knowing who you are and trusting that it's okay to be that person. When you're constantly adjusting to fit what others want, you lose touch with that steady ground. You lose the sense that you can trust yourself. That your instincts are valid. That your perspective has value. Because if you're always editing yourself, how can you trust what's underneath the edit? If you're always performing, how can you know what's real? This is the hidden cost of caring too much about what others think. It's not just that you exhaust yourself trying to please everyone. It's that in the process, you lose the ability to please yourself. You lose the ability to even know what would please you. Because you've spent so long tuning into what others want that you've stopped tuning into what you want. You've spent so long asking what will they think, that you've forgotten to ask what do I think. And this creates a strange kind of emptiness. Not the kind that's loud and obvious, but the kind that shows up as a vague sense of disconnection. A feeling that something is missing, but you're not quite sure what. You look at your life from the outside, and it might even look fine. You're doing the things you're supposed to do. You're maintaining relationships. You're avoiding conflict. You're getting through your days. But something doesn't feel right. And often, what doesn't feel right is that you've become a stranger to yourself. You've spent so long adjusting, performing, managing perceptions, that you've lost track of who you are beneath all of that. You've become so focused on being acceptable that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be. And this is not a small thing. This is not something you can dismiss as trivial or dramatic. This is the slow erosion of your sense of self. And it happens to more people than you might think. Because the pressure to be liked, to be approved of, to fit in, is everywhere. It's in every social interaction. Every online post. Every conversation where you're deciding how much of yourself to reveal and how much to keep hidden. And the more you adjust, the more normal it feels. The more automatic it becomes. Until one day you realize you don't even know what your real opinion is anymore. You don't know what you actually want. You don't know who you are when no one is watching. Because you've spent so long being who you think others want you to be that you've forgotten who you were before you started performing. And this forgetting has consequences. It shows up in the way you struggle to make decisions. Because if you don't know what you want, how can you choose? It shows up in the way you feel resentful, even toward people you care about. Because when you're always prioritizing their needs over your own, eventually that imbalance starts to wear on you. It shows up in the way you feel disconnected in your relationships. Because if you're never showing people who you really are, how can they ever really know you? And if they don't really know you, how can the connection ever feel genuine? This is the cost of caring too much. Not just exhaustion. Not just stress. But a fundamental disconnection from yourself. And the cruel irony is that this disconnection doesn't even achieve what you hoped it would. Because the approval you gain through constant adjustment is not real approval. It's approval of the version of you that you've constructed. The performance. The edit. And deep down, you know this. You know that if people only like the adjusted version of you, then they don't actually like you. They like the mask you're wearing. And that knowledge, whether you consciously acknowledge it or not, prevents you from ever really feeling secure in their approval. Because you know that if they saw the real you, the unedited, unadjusted, unperformed version, they might not approve at all. And so you keep performing. You keep adjusting. You keep hiding. And the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be grows wider. And the wider that gap becomes, the more internal tension you carry. Because suppressing your real thoughts and feelings doesn't make them go away. It just pushes them beneath the surface. And beneath the surface, they don't disappear. They accumulate. They accumulate as tension in your body. As tightness in your chest. As a knot in your stomach. As a vague sense of unease that you can't quite name. They accumulate as irritability. As frustration. As sudden bursts of emotion that seem disproportionate to the situation. They accumulate as exhaustion. Not just physical tiredness, but a deep, bone-level weariness that comes from holding yourself together, from keeping the performance going, from never really letting yourself relax. Because when you're always suppressing, you're always braced. Always on guard. Always managing. And that kind of vigilance is exhausting. It's exhausting to monitor every word before it leaves your mouth. To calculate every response before you give it. To scan every room for signs of how you're being received. It's exhausting to live in a constant state of self-editing. And over time, that exhaustion turns into something else. It turns into numbness. Into disconnection. Into a vague sense that you're going through the motions of life without ever really living it. Because you're not living. You're performing. And performance, no matter how convincing, is not the same as presence. When you're performing, you're always slightly removed from the moment. Always watching yourself from the outside. Always thinking about how you're coming across rather than simply being there. And this removes you from the richness of your own experience. You're in a conversation, but you're not really listening. You're thinking about what to say next. You're monitoring your body language. You're checking to see if the other person seems engaged. You're at an event, but you're not really enjoying it. You're wondering if you're talking to the right people. You're worrying about whether you're making a good impression. You're calculating how long you need to stay before you can leave without seeming rude. You're with people you care about, but you're not really present. You're managing. You're adjusting. You're performing. And in the process, you miss the actual moments. You miss the connection. The spontaneity. The ease that comes from simply being yourself without trying to control how it's received. You miss the freedom that comes from not caring so much about what everyone thinks. And that freedom is not recklessness. It's not indifference. It's not arrogance. It's just the ability to be present. To be real. to show up as you are and trust that it's enough. But when you've spent years, maybe decades, learning to adjust and perform and suppress, that freedom feels impossible. It feels risky. It feels vulnerable. It feels like too much exposure. Because you've internalized the belief that who you really are is not acceptable. That if you stop performing, you'll be rejected. That if you stop suppressing, you'll be too much, too loud, too different, too something. And so you keep adjusting. You keep performing. You keep caring what everyone thinks. And the cost continues to accumulate. It accumulates in the way you feel about yourself. In the way you've learned to see yourself through other people's eyes rather than your own. In the way you've learned to measure your worth by how well you're received rather than by who you actually are. And this external measuring stick is unstable. Because other people's opinions change. They shift based on mood, context, circumstance. What one person values, another dismisses. What works in one situation fails in another. And so you're constantly recalibrating. Constantly adjusting. Constantly trying to hit a target that keeps moving. And in the process, you lose touch with your own internal measuring stick. You lose touch with the quiet, steady sense of self that doesn't depend on external validation. The sense that you have value simply because you exist, not because you've managed to impress everyone around you. And this loss is profound. Because without that internal sense of worth, you're always at the mercy of other people's opinions. You're always vulnerable to their judgment. You're always dependent on their approval to feel okay about yourself. And that dependency keeps you trapped. It keeps you adjusting. It keeps you performing. It keeps you small. Because when you need approval to feel okay, you can't risk doing anything that might jeopardize that approval. You can't speak up when you disagree. You can't set boundaries when you're uncomfortable. You can't pursue what you actually want if it means disappointing someone else. And so you stay where you are. Safe. Acceptable. Approved of. But not free. Not fulfilled. Not really yourself. And this is the deepest cost of caring too much about what others think. Not just that it's exhausting. Not just that it's inauthentic. But that it prevents you from ever really living your own life. Because if you're always adjusting to fit what others want, you're never living according to what you want. You're never pursuing what matters to you. You're never building a life that reflects your values, your interests, your vision. You're building a life that reflects everyone else's expectations. And that life, no matter how well executed, will always feel hollow. Because it's not yours. It's a performance. A carefully constructed image. A version of you that's been edited and adjusted and shaped to be as inoffensive and acceptable as possible. And while that version might be well liked, it's not real. And deep down, you know it. And that knowledge creates a kind of quiet despair. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a persistent sense that something is missing. That you're not really living. That you're going through the motions without ever really engaging. And this despair doesn't come from external circumstances. It comes from internal disconnection. From the fact that you've abandoned yourself in pursuit of approval. From the fact that you've prioritized being liked over being real. From the fact that you've spent so much time adjusting to fit what others want that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be yourself. And the path out of this pattern is not easy. It's not quick. It's not a single decision that changes everything overnight. But it begins with awareness. With noticing the moments when you adjust. When you suppress. When you perform. With noticing the cost of those adjustments. The exhaustion. The disconnection. The resentment. With noticing that the approval you're gaining through constant performance is not actually making you feel secure. It's not actually filling the emptiness. It's not actually giving you what you thought it would. Because what you're really seeking is not external approval. It's internal peace. It's the ability to be yourself without constantly worrying about how you're being received. It's the freedom to speak your truth without needing everyone to agree with it. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and being okay with it, even when others aren't. And that confidence, that internal sense of okayness, is not something you gain through approval. It's something you build through self-acceptance. Through learning to value your own perspective, even when it's different from everyone else's. Through learning to honor your own feelings, even when they're inconvenient. Through learning to trust your own instincts, even when they lead you in a direction that others don't understand. This is not about becoming selfish or indifferent to others. It's about reclaiming your sense of self. It's about recognizing that you can care about people without abandoning yourself in the process. It's about understanding that real relationships are built on authenticity, not performance. And that the people who matter will appreciate you more when you're real than when you're perfect. Because perfection is boring. It's predictable. It's safe. But it's not interesting. It's not engaging. It's not real. And most people, whether they consciously realize it or not, are drawn to realness. They're drawn to people who are comfortable enough in their own skin to just be themselves. They're drawn to people who aren't performing. Who aren't constantly scanning for approval. Who aren't adjusting every word to fit what they think others want to hear. They're drawn to people who have enough internal stability that they don't need constant validation to feel okay. And that stability is not something you're born with. It's something you build. You build it by noticing when you're adjusting out of fear rather than choice. You build it by questioning the belief that you need everyone's approval to be okay. You build it by allowing yourself to be imperfect, to be misunderstood, to be disliked by some people. You build it by learning that being judged is not the end of the world. That disapproval is not death. That rejection, while uncomfortable, is survivable. And as you build this stability, something shifts. You start to care less about what everyone thinks. Not because you've become cold or indifferent, but because you've developed a stronger sense of what you think. You start to prioritize your own values over other people's opinions. Not because their opinions don't matter, but because your values matter more. You start to show up more authentically in your relationships. Not because you've stopped caring about people, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself to please them. And in this shift, you begin to reclaim your life. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic transformation. But slowly. Steadily. One choice at a time. One moment where you speak up instead of staying silent. One moment where you honor your preference instead of deferring to someone else's. One moment where you allow yourself to be seen as you are, rather than as you think you should be. These moments accumulate. And over time, they rebuild what was lost. They rebuild your sense of self. Your confidence. Your internal compass. They rebuild your ability to trust yourself. To know what you want. To believe that your perspective has value. And as that rebuilding happens, the cost of caring too much begins to fade. Not because you've stopped caring entirely, but because you've learned to care about the right things. You've learned to care more about living honestly than about being liked by everyone. You've learned to care more about internal integrity than external approval. You've learned to care more about being real than about being perfect. And in that learning, you find something you didn't know was missing. You find yourself. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. Not the version that's been edited to fit what others expect. But the real version. The one that existed before you learned to suppress it. The one that's been waiting, quietly, beneath all the performance, for you to remember it's there. And that version, imperfect and flawed and real, is the one worth living as. Because it's yours. And no amount of approval is worth losing it. The distinction between internal respect and external approval becomes clearer as you move through this process. They are not the same thing, though they're often confused. External approval is what you receive from others. It's their validation, their praise, their acknowledgement. It feels good when it comes. It feels painful when it doesn't. And it's completely outside your control. You can influence it, to some degree. You can adjust your behavior to make approval more likely. But you can never guarantee it. Because other people's opinions are shaped by factors you can't see and variables you can't manage. Their mood. Their history. Their insecurities. Their expectations. Their biases. All of these things filter how they perceive you, and none of them are within your power to change. So chasing external approval is, in a sense, chasing something that will always be just out of reach. You can get close. You can receive it in moments. But you can never secure it permanently. Because it's not yours to secure. It belongs to other people. And people change their minds. Internal respect, on the other hand, is something different entirely. It's not about what others think of you. It's about what you think of yourself. And more specifically, it's about whether you're living in a way that aligns with your own values. It's about whether you can look at your choices and feel okay with them. Not perfect. Not flawless. But okay. It's about whether you're being honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Whether you're standing by what you believe, even when it's unpopular. Whether you're honoring your own boundaries, even when doing so disappoints someone else. Internal respect is built through integrity. Through the alignment between what you believe and how you act. Through the consistent choice to be real rather than to be liked. And unlike external approval, it's entirely within your control. You can't control whether people approve of you. But you can control whether you approve of yourself. You can't control whether people respect you. But you can control whether you respect yourself. And that distinction matters. Because when your sense of worth is tied to external approval, you're always vulnerable. Always dependent. Always at risk of collapse if the approval stops coming. But when your sense of worth is tied to internal respect, you're stable. You're grounded. You have a foundation that doesn't crumble when people disagree with you or judge you or walk away. This doesn't mean you stop caring what people think entirely. It just means you stop needing their approval to feel okay. You stop abandoning your values to gain their validation. You stop suppressing your truth to avoid their judgment. You stop performing a version of yourself that you don't even recognize, just to keep them comfortable. And in stopping these things, you reclaim something essential. You reclaim your dignity. Not the loud, performative kind. But the quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing you're living honestly. The kind that comes from respecting yourself enough to stop betraying yourself for the sake of approval. And this shift, from external approval to internal respect, is not easy. It requires you to tolerate discomfort. To sit with the fear of being judged. To accept that some people won't like you, and that's okay. But it's worth it. Because the alternative, spending your life adjusting, performing, suppressing, is a life half-lived. It's a life spent in service of other people's comfort rather than your own truth. And that's not a small price to pay. That's everything. Your sense of self. Your confidence. Your clarity. Your peace. All of it gets sacrificed on the altar of approval. And for what? For the fleeting validation of people who may not even care as much as you think they do. For the temporary comfort of avoiding conflict. For the illusion of safety that comes from fitting in. But fitting in is not the same as belonging. Fitting in requires you to adjust. To suppress. To perform. Belonging requires you to be real. And the people who are worth being around are the ones who want you to be real. Who appreciate you more when you're honest than when you're perfect. Who value your presence, not your performance. Those people exist. But you won't find them if you're always performing. Because performance attracts performance. Masks attract masks. If you want real connection, you have to show up real. And yes, that's risky. Yes, that's uncomfortable. Yes, that means some people won't like you. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is a life spent hiding, adjusting, performing. And that life, no matter how carefully constructed, will always feel empty. Because it's not really yours. It's a reflection of everyone else's expectations. A composite image of what you think people want you to be. And living that way costs you everything. It costs you your energy, your peace, your sense of self. It costs you the ability to know what you want, to trust what you feel, to believe that who you are is enough. And that cost is not worth paying. Not for approval. Not for acceptance. Not for the temporary comfort of avoiding judgment. Because in the end, the only approval that really matters is your own. The only respect that sustains you is internal. And the only life worth living is the one that's actually yours. Chapter 4: Reclaiming Inner Authority. There comes a point where you realize that not everything is within your control. And while this might sound limiting, it's actually the beginning of freedom. Because as long as you believe you can control how others perceive you, you'll keep trying. You'll keep adjusting. You'll keep performing. You'll keep exhausting yourself in pursuit of something that was never really achievable in the first place. But when you accept that their thoughts, their opinions, their reactions are outside your sphere of influence, something shifts. Not into helplessness. Not into apathy. But into clarity. You begin to see where your actual power lies. And it's not in controlling their perception. It's in deciding who you're going to be, regardless of how that's received. This distinction is everything. Because most of your mental energy has probably been spent trying to manage things you can't actually manage. Trying to control variables that were never yours to control. You can't control whether someone likes you. You can influence it, perhaps. You can be kind, considerate, thoughtful. But ultimately, whether they like you depends on factors you can't see and preferences you can't predict. You can't control whether someone approves of your choices. You can explain yourself. You can justify your reasoning. But their approval depends on their values, their experiences, their worldview. None of which you can change. You can't control whether someone judges you. You can present yourself carefully. You can try to minimize misunderstanding. But people will interpret you through their own lens, and that lens is shaped by things that have nothing to do with you. So the question becomes, if you can't control these things, why are you spending so much energy trying to? And the answer, often, is because you've been taught that you should. That managing perception is part of being socially competent. That caring what people think is a sign of emotional intelligence. And to some degree, that's true. Awareness of how you're affecting others is useful. Consideration for their feelings is valuable. Adjusting your approach based on context is often appropriate. But there's a difference between awareness and obsession. Between consideration and self-abandonment. Between adjusting your approach and losing yourself entirely. And somewhere along the way, you may have crossed that line without noticing. You may have moved from healthy social awareness into unhealthy dependence on external validation. From thoughtful consideration into constant performance. From appropriate adjustment into complete suppression of who you actually are. And that crossing has cost you more than you realize. It's cost you your peace of mind. Because when you're trying to control the uncontrollable, you're never at rest. You're always vigilant. Always scanning. Always adjusting. It's cost you your clarity. Because when you're focused on managing perception, you lose touch with what you actually think and feel beneath the management. It's cost you your confidence. Because when your sense of worth depends on external approval, you're always vulnerable to its withdrawal. And reclaiming your inner authority means reversing this pattern. It means recognizing where your control actually lies and releasing your grip on everything else. It means accepting that you can't control their thoughts, but you can control your own. You can't control their reactions, but you can control your choices. You can't control their judgment, but you can control whether you let that judgment define you. This is not resignation. It's not giving up. It's redirection. It's redirecting your energy from trying to control the external world to cultivating your internal world. From managing perception to building integrity. From chasing approval to respecting yourself. And this redirection begins with a simple recognition: most of what you worry about is outside your control. Whether they like you, whether they approve, whether they judge you favorably or unfavorably. These things are not yours to determine. And once you see this clearly, the weight begins to lift. Not all at once, but gradually. Because when you stop trying to control the uncontrollable, you stop wasting energy on an impossible task. And that energy becomes available for something more useful. For knowing yourself. For living according to your values. For building a life that feels real rather than performed. This is where inner authority begins to take root. Not as dominance over others. Not as arrogance or indifference. But as a quiet, steady sense of self-direction. A sense that you know what you believe, and you're willing to stand by it. That you know what matters to you, and you're willing to pursue it. That you know who you are, and you're willing to be that person, even when it's uncomfortable. This kind of authority doesn't come from certainty. It doesn't require you to have everything figured out. It doesn't mean you never doubt yourself or wonder if you're making the right choice. It just means that when you do doubt, when you do wonder, you turn inward for answers rather than outward. You check in with yourself rather than checking in with everyone else. You ask what feels right to you rather than what will be received well by others. You trust your own sense of direction rather than constantly deferring to external guidance. And this trust is not something you're born with. It's something you build. Over time. Through practice. Through the repeated experience of honoring your own perspective and realizing that the catastrophic outcomes you feared didn't materialize. You speak up, and the world doesn't end. You set a boundary, and the relationship doesn't collapse. You make a choice that others don't understand, and you survive the discomfort of their confusion. These experiences accumulate. And as they do, your trust in yourself grows. Not into arrogance. Not into rigidity. But into a quiet confidence that doesn't require constant external validation to remain intact. This is what quiet confidence actually is. Not loud. Not performative. Not dependent on proving anything to anyone. It's just the steady sense that you can trust yourself. That your perspective has value. That your choices, even when imperfect, are yours to make. And it's important to understand what this confidence is not. It's not the absence of doubt. You'll still question yourself. You'll still wonder if you're doing the right thing. You'll still feel uncertain at times. But the difference is that the uncertainty no longer paralyzes you. It no longer sends you into a spiral of seeking reassurance from everyone around you. You can sit with the uncertainty. You can acknowledge it. And you can still move forward. Quiet confidence is also not the same as knowing everything. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be certain about every decision. You don't have to project an image of having it all figured out. You can be honest about what you don't know. You can be open to learning. You can change your mind when new information emerges. But the foundation beneath all of that, the sense that you're capable of navigating uncertainty, that you can trust your judgment even when it's imperfect, that remains steady. And perhaps most importantly, quiet confidence is not about being right all the time. You'll make mistakes. You'll misjudge situations. You'll look back on some of your choices and wish you'd done things differently. But those mistakes don't collapse your sense of self. They don't send you into a crisis of identity. They don't make you question your fundamental worth. Because your worth is not tied to being perfect. It's not tied to always making the right choice. It's not tied to having everyone approve of you. It's tied to something deeper. Something more stable. Something that doesn't fluctuate based on external circumstances. It's tied to your integrity, to the alignment between what you value and how you act, to the commitment to being honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable. And this foundation, this inner authority, is what allows you to navigate the world without constantly needing external validation. You can receive feedback without collapsing under it. You can be criticized without assuming the criticism defines you. You can be misunderstood without desperately trying to correct every misperception. Because you know who you are. And that knowing doesn't depend on whether others see it. But building this kind of inner authority requires a particular skill. A skill that's simple to describe but challenging to practice. It's the skill of observing your thoughts without identifying with them. This might sound abstract, but it's actually quite practical. Because most of the time, you don't observe your thoughts. You are your thoughts. There's no distance between the thinker and the thought. Whatever arises in your mind feels like the truth. Feels like reality. Feels like who you are. Someone gives you a critical look, and the thought arises, they don't like me. And immediately, without any space between the thought and your response to it, you believe it. You feel it. You react to it. You make a choice that others don't understand, and the thought arises, I made a mistake. And without questioning it, without examining it, you accept it as fact. You express an opinion, and someone disagrees, and the thought arises, I shouldn't have said anything. And you're already regretting your words before you've even considered whether the thought is accurate. This is what it means to identify with your thoughts. To take them at face value. To assume that because a thought appeared in your mind, it must be true. But thoughts are not facts. They're interpretations. Guesses. Automatic responses generated by a brain that's trying to make sense of the world. And many of those interpretations are inaccurate. Many of those guesses are wrong. Many of those automatic responses are based on outdated beliefs or fears that no longer serve you. So learning to observe your thoughts, to create space between the thought and your reaction to it, is essential to reclaiming your inner authority. Because when you can observe a thought without immediately believing it, you can evaluate it. You can question it. You can decide whether it's useful or accurate or worth acting on. Someone gives you a critical look, and the thought arises, they don't like me. But this time, instead of immediately believing it, you notice it. You see it as a thought. And you can ask, is that true? Or is that an assumption? Could there be other explanations for their expression? And in that questioning, the thought loses its grip. It's no longer the absolute truth. It's just one possible interpretation among many. This doesn't mean you dismiss all your thoughts. Some of them are useful. Some of them are accurate. Some of them point to things that genuinely need your attention. But you're no longer at the mercy of every thought that passes through your mind. You're no longer reacting automatically to every interpretation your brain generates. You're observing, evaluating, choosing. And that capacity, the capacity to observe without identifying, is what creates the space for inner authority to develop. Because when you're not identified with every thought, you're not destabilized by every negative interpretation. You're not thrown off course by every moment of self-doubt. You're not paralyzed by every fear that arises. You can notice the doubt without letting it stop you. You can acknowledge the fear without letting it control you. You can see the negative interpretation without assuming it's the whole truth. And in that space, the space between the thought and your response to it, you reclaim your power. Not power over others. Not power to control outcomes. But power over yourself. Power to choose your response. Power to act according to your values rather than your fears. This is what inner authority looks like in practice. It's not about never feeling doubt or fear. It's about not being controlled by those feelings. It's not about never having negative thoughts. It's about not believing every negative thought that arises. It's not about being certain all the time. It's about being willing to move forward even when you're not. And this willingness, this capacity to act in alignment with your values even when it's uncomfortable, is what separates inner authority from external dependence. When you're dependent on external validation, you need certainty before you act. You need approval before you speak. You need reassurance before you make a choice. But when you've cultivated inner authority, you can act without those things. You can tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty. You can speak without needing everyone to agree. You can make choices without requiring external validation. Not because you don't care what others think, but because you care more about living honestly than about being comfortable. You care more about acting with integrity than about avoiding judgment. You care more about being real than about being liked. And this shift in priorities, from external approval to internal integrity, is what allows you to step out of the pattern that's been keeping you trapped. Because as long as approval is your priority, you'll keep adjusting. You'll keep performing. You'll keep suppressing who you really are in service of being acceptable. But when integrity becomes your priority, the game changes. You stop asking what will they think, and start asking what do I believe is right. You stop adjusting to fit their expectations and start living according to your own values. You stop performing a version of yourself that you don't recognize and start showing up as you actually are. And yes, this is uncomfortable. Yes, this means some people won't approve. Yes, this means being judged, being misunderstood, being criticized at times. But it also means something else. Something more valuable. It means being free. Not free from judgment. That's not possible. But free from the need to control judgment. Free from the exhausting effort of managing perception. Free from the constant vigilance required to maintain a performance. And in that freedom, you find something you may have lost along the way. You find yourself. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. Not the version that's been shaped to fit what others expect. But the real version. The one that knows what it thinks. The one that trusts what it feels. The one that can stand by its choices, even when those choices aren't popular. And this version, imperfect, uncertain, real, is the one that carries inner authority. Because inner authority doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from trusting that you can navigate the questions. It doesn't come from being right all the time. It comes from being willing to be wrong and learning from it. It doesn't come from being liked by everyone. It comes from respecting yourself enough to stop abandoning your truth for the sake of approval. And as you cultivate this authority, you begin to notice changes. You begin to notice that you're less reactive. That other people's opinions, while you might consider them, don't destabilize you the way they once did. You begin to notice that you're less dependent. That you can make choices without needing constant reassurance that you're making the right ones. You begin to notice that you're more present. That you're not spending as much mental energy scanning for signs of approval or disapproval. That you're actually there, in the moment, rather than constantly monitoring how you're being perceived. And these changes don't happen all at once. They accumulate slowly. Over weeks. Over months. Over years, even. But each time you choose inner integrity over external approval, you strengthen this foundation. Each time you observe a thought without identifying with it, you create more space for clarity. Each time you act according to your values, even when it's uncomfortable, you build more trust in yourself. And over time, this becomes your new baseline. Not perfection. Not the absence of doubt or fear. But a steady sense of self that doesn't require constant external validation to remain intact. A sense that you can trust yourself. That you can handle uncertainty. That you can be judged and still be okay. This is inner authority. And it's available to you. Not as something you have to achieve. Not as something you have to earn. But as something you reclaim. Something that was always there, beneath the performance. Beneath the adjustment. Beneath the constant scanning for approval. It was always there. You just forgot how to access it. And the way back is not through trying harder. Not through forcing yourself to stop caring what people think. Not through building walls around yourself or becoming indifferent to others. The way back is through awareness. Through noticing when you're adjusting out of fear. Through recognizing when you're identifying with thoughts that aren't serving you. Through seeing clearly where your control actually lies and releasing your grip on everything else. This is the work. Not dramatic. Not flashy. Not something that announces itself with fanfare. Just steady. Just consistent. Just the quiet practice of coming back to yourself, again and again, until being yourself stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like home. And in that homecoming, you find what you've been searching for all along. Not approval. Not validation. Not the certainty that everyone likes you. But something better. Something more stable. Something that doesn't depend on external circumstances to remain intact. You find your own authority. Your own ground. Your own sense of direction. And from that place, you can navigate the world without losing yourself in it. You can care about people without abandoning yourself to please them. You can consider feedback without collapsing under it. You can be misunderstood without desperately trying to correct every misperception. You can be judged without assuming the judgment defines you. Because you know who you are. And that knowing doesn't require anyone else's permission to be valid. It doesn't require their approval to be real. It doesn't require their understanding to be true. It just is. And that, more than anything else, is what freedom feels like. Not the absence of challenge. Not the absence of discomfort. Not the absence of judgment. But the presence of self. The presence of clarity. The presence of a quiet, steady authority that doesn't waver every time someone disagrees with you. This is what's possible when you stop trying to control what you can't control and start focusing on what you can. When you stop trying to manage everyone's perception and start managing your own integrity. When you stop chasing approval and start building respect for yourself. It's not easy. It's not quick. It's not a single decision that changes everything overnight. But it's worth it. Because the alternative, spending your life adjusting, performing, suppressing, is no way to live. And you deserve better than that. You deserve to know yourself. To trust yourself. To respect yourself. You deserve to live a life that's actually yours. And that life begins the moment you stop waiting for permission and start reclaiming your inner authority. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Not through force. But quietly. Steadily. Through the simple, repeated choice to be real. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's not popular. Even when no one else understands. Because in the end, the only person who needs to understand is you. And the only approval that really matters is your own. And as you continue on this path, you begin to notice something subtle. Something that doesn't announce itself with drama or fanfare. You begin to notice that the people around you respond differently. Not because you're trying to make them respond differently. Not because you're performing a new version of yourself. But because something fundamental has shifted in how you show up. When you stop seeking approval, people sense it. They may not consciously recognize what's changed, but they feel it. There's a steadiness to your presence that wasn't there before. A groundedness that doesn't require their validation to remain intact. And paradoxically, this often makes you more respected. Not because you're trying to be respected. But because respect tends to flow toward people who respect themselves. When you're no longer desperate for approval, you're no longer giving your power away. You're no longer adjusting and performing and suppressing. You're just being. And that authenticity, that simple act of being real, is often more compelling than any performance could ever be. This doesn't mean everyone will like you. In fact, some people might like you less. Because when you stop performing, you stop being what they wanted you to be. You stop fitting into the box they had constructed for you. You stop playing the role they expected you to play. And for some people, that's uncomfortable. For some people, your authenticity challenges their own patterns of adjustment and performance. It reminds them of what they're not allowing themselves to be. And that reminder can trigger resistance, judgment, even hostility. But here's what you begin to understand: their resistance is not about you. It's about them. It's about their own relationship with authenticity. Their own fear of being real. Their own dependence on approval. And you don't need to fix that. You don't need to convince them. You don't need to adjust yourself back into the shape they're comfortable with. You can simply let them have their reaction. You can let them think what they think. You can let them be uncomfortable with your authenticity. Because their comfort is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself. To your integrity. To the commitment you've made to live honestly rather than to live in constant performance. And as you hold to this commitment, you begin to notice another shift. The relationships in your life start to change. Some relationships become deeper. Because when you show up authentically, you create space for others to do the same. You create permission for real connection. For conversations that go beneath the surface. For moments of genuine understanding. Other relationships begin to fade. Not through conflict or dramatic endings, but through a natural drift. Because some relationships were built on performance. They were built on you being who they wanted you to be. And when you stop performing that role, there's nothing left to sustain the connection. And this can be painful. It can feel like loss. It can trigger doubt about whether you're making the right choice. But as you sit with that discomfort, you begin to see it more clearly. You begin to see that relationships built on performance were never really sustainable. They required constant maintenance, constant adjustment, constant suppression of who you actually are. And that kind of relationship, while it might have felt safe, was also exhausting. It was also limiting. It was also preventing you from ever being truly known. So the loss, while real, is also making space. Making space for relationships that can hold your authenticity. Making space for connections that don't require you to perform. Making space for people who appreciate you for who you are, not for who you're pretending to be. And as these new connections form, or as old connections deepen, you begin to experience something you may not have experienced in a long time. You begin to experience the relief of being seen. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. But the real version. And being seen this way, being known this way, is different from being approved of. Approval is surface level. It's based on meeting expectations. On fitting into predetermined categories. On being what others want you to be. Being seen is deeper. It's based on recognition. On understanding. On someone perceiving who you actually are and accepting that person, flaws and all. And this kind of connection, while rarer, is also more valuable. Because it doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't require constant performance. It doesn't require you to suppress yourself. You can simply be. And that's enough. This is what becomes possible when you reclaim your inner authority. Not just a change in how you see yourself, but a change in how you relate to others. A change in the quality of your connections. A change in the depth of your relationships. But this process is not linear. It's not a steady march toward some final destination where you've completely transcended the need for approval and achieved perfect inner authority. There will be moments when you slip back. Moments when someone's judgment hits you harder than you expected. Moments when you find yourself adjusting again, performing again, seeking approval again. And that's not failure. That's just being human. The pattern you're working with has been reinforced over years, maybe decades. It's not going to disappear completely. It's going to resurface, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. But the difference is that now you recognize it. Now you can see it happening. Now you have the awareness to notice when you're slipping back into old patterns. And that awareness creates choice. You can notice that you're seeking approval, and you can choose to redirect. You can notice that you're suppressing your truth, and you can choose to speak up. You can notice that you're performing, and you can choose to be real. Not every time. Not perfectly. But more often than before. And each time you make that choice, you strengthen the new pattern. You reinforce the foundation of inner authority. You remind yourself that you can trust your own judgment, that you can stand by your own values, that you can be yourself even when it's uncomfortable. This is the work. Not dramatic transformation. Not complete elimination of old patterns. Just the steady, consistent practice of noticing and choosing. Of coming back to yourself. Of remembering that your worth is not determined by external approval. And as you continue this practice, something interesting happens. The old pattern starts to feel less natural. The constant scanning for approval starts to feel exhausting in a way it didn't before. The performance starts to feel hollow. Because now you know what the alternative feels like. You know what it's like to be grounded in your own authority. You know what it's like to make choices based on your values rather than on what will be well received. You know what it's like to simply be yourself without constantly monitoring how it's landing. And once you've tasted that freedom, it's hard to go back. It's hard to return to the constant vigilance, the endless adjustment, the exhausting performance. Not because you've become arrogant or indifferent, but because you've remembered what it feels like to be real. And that feeling is too valuable to give up. So you keep choosing it. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it triggers judgment. Even when it costs you approval from people who only like the performed version of you. You keep choosing authenticity over acceptance. Integrity over approval. Realness over comfort. And over time, this becomes less of a conscious choice and more of a natural way of being. It becomes your new baseline. Your new normal. Not perfect. Not free from doubt. Not immune to the sting of judgment. But steady. Grounded. Clear about who you are and what you value. This is what reclaiming inner authority looks like in practice. Not some lofty ideal that exists only in theory, but a lived reality. A daily practice. A consistent choice to trust yourself more than you trust other people's opinions of you. And as this authority solidifies, you begin to notice something else. You begin to notice that your relationship with your thoughts has fundamentally changed. Before, thoughts felt like truths. If a thought said they don't like you, you believed it. If a thought said you made a mistake, you accepted it. If a thought said you shouldn't have said that, you internalized it. But now, there's space. There's distance. There's the recognition that thoughts are not facts, but interpretations. And interpretations can be questioned. Someone gives you a critical look, and the thought arises, they don't like me. But instead of immediately spiraling into anxiety, you pause. You observe the thought. You recognize it as an automatic interpretation, not necessarily an accurate one. And in that recognition, the thought loses its power. It's no longer the absolute truth that dictates your emotional state. It's just a thought. One possible interpretation among many. This capacity to observe without identifying is perhaps the most important skill you can develop. Because it's what allows you to remain stable in the face of external judgment. It's what allows you to consider feedback without collapsing under it. It's what allows you to be criticized without assuming the criticism defines you. You can hear the criticism. You can consider whether there's truth in it. You can learn from it if it's useful. But you don't have to believe that it's the final word on who you are. You don't have to let it destabilize your sense of self. You don't have to adjust yourself to fit what the critic wants. You can simply receive the information and decide what to do with it. And that decision is yours to make, not theirs. This is what inner authority looks like. Not rigidity. Not defensiveness. not dismissing all feedback, but the capacity to evaluate feedback through your own filter rather than accepting it uncritically. The capacity to consider whether it aligns with your values and your sense of what's true. The capacity to learn from it without being defined by it. And this capacity doesn't just apply to external criticism. It also applies to your own internal critic. Because often, the harshest judgment doesn't come from others. It comes from within. From the voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough. That you should have done better. That you're failing in some fundamental way. This internal critic is often just an internalized version of all the external judgment you've received over the years. It's the voice of every person who ever made you feel like you weren't acceptable as you are. The voice of every expectation you failed to meet. The voice of every standard you couldn't live up to. And for a long time, you may have believed this voice was telling you the truth. That it was keeping you in line. That it was motivating you to improve. But as you develop inner authority, you begin to see this voice more clearly. You begin to recognize it for what it is, not truth, but fear. Not motivation, but control. Not helpful guidance, but destructive criticism. And you begin to question it. To challenge it. To refuse to accept its pronouncements as fact. When it says you're not good enough, you can ask, by whose standards? For what purpose? And is that even true, or is it just an old belief that's been repeated so many times it feels like truth? When it says you should have done better, you can ask, better according to whom? And did I do the best I could with the awareness and resources I had at the time? When it says you're failing, you can ask, at what? And who decided that this particular outcome equals failure? These questions create space. They create distance between you and the voice. They remind you that this internal critic is not you. It's just a voice. A pattern. A collection of old beliefs that you don't have to continue carrying. And as you create this distance, the voice begins to lose its grip. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming quieter. Less automatic. Less convincing. And in the space that opens up, you can hear other voices. Kinder voices. More accurate voices. Voices that remind you of your worth, your capability, your inherent value. Not in some exaggerated, artificial way. Not in the forced positivity that tries to cover up genuine self-doubt. But in a grounded, realistic way. In a way that acknowledges your imperfections without letting them define you. In a way that recognizes your struggles without collapsing under them. In a way that sees you clearly, flaws and all, and still finds you worthy of respect. This is what inner authority sounds like. Not harsh. Not demanding. Not critical. But steady. Clear. Honest. It's the voice that says, you're doing the best you can with what you have right now. The voice that says, you don't have to be perfect to be valuable. The voice that says, you can make mistakes and still be worthy of respect. And as this voice becomes stronger, as you learn to trust it more than the critical voice, something shifts in how you move through the world. You become less defensive. Because you're not carrying the constant fear that someone's going to expose your inadequacy. You know you're imperfect. You've accepted that. You're not trying to hide it anymore. You become less reactive. Because other people's opinions, while you might consider them, don't have the power to destabilize you. You have your own foundation. Your own sense of who you are. And that foundation doesn't crumble every time someone disagrees with you. You become less anxious. Because you're no longer trying to control the uncontrollable. You're no longer spending mental energy trying to manage every person's perception of you. You're just focused on living with integrity. And that focus, while not eliminating anxiety entirely, significantly reduces it. Because anxiety often comes from the gap between who you are and who you're trying to appear to be. From the fear that someone will see through the performance. From the exhausting effort of maintaining an image that doesn't match your internal reality. But when you close that gap, When you align your external presentation with your internal truth, much of that anxiety dissolves. Not because life becomes easier. Not because you stop caring what people think. But because you're no longer carrying the burden of a constant performance. You can simply be. And that simplicity, that ease, is worth everything you had to release to get here. All the approval you had to stop chasing. All the performances you had to stop maintaining. All the adjustments you had to stop making. It was worth it. Because what you gained, your sense of self, your inner authority, your freedom to be real, is more valuable than any amount of external validation could ever be. And as you settle into this new way of being, you realize something. You realize that you're not actually alone in this struggle. That most people are dealing with the same pattern. Most people are seeking approval. Most people are performing. Most people are suppressing who they really are in service of being acceptable. And this recognition creates compassion. Not just for yourself, but for others. You begin to see that when people judge you, they're often projecting their own insecurities. When they criticize you, they're often speaking from their own fear. When they disapprove of you, they're often reacting to something in themselves that your authenticity has triggered. And this understanding doesn't make their judgment less painful. But it does make it less personal. It reminds you that their reaction is about them, not about you. That their opinion is filtered through their own lens, their own history, their own patterns. And you don't have to take it on. You don't have to internalize it. You don't have to let it define you. You can simply let it be what it is, their perspective. Valid for them, perhaps. But not the ultimate truth about who you are. And in this letting go, in this release of the need to control how others see you, you find a peace that was never available when you were constantly trying to manage perception. A peace that comes from knowing you're living honestly. From knowing you're acting with integrity. From knowing you're being true to yourself, even when that truth is misunderstood or judged or rejected by others. This peace is not the absence of challenge. It's not the absence of discomfort. It's not the absence of judgment. It's the presence of alignment. The presence of integrity. The presence of a life that feels real rather than performed. And that presence, quiet and steady as it is what makes everything else bearable. Because when you're aligned with yourself, when you're living from your inner authority, the external chaos doesn't destabilize you the way it once did. You can weather the storms. You can handle the criticism. You can tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. Not because you've become thick-skinned or indifferent, but because you're grounded in something deeper. Something more stable. Something that doesn't depend on external circumstances to remain intact. And that grounding, that foundation, is what you've been building all along. Not through dramatic transformation. Not through force of will. Not through trying to become someone you're not. But through the simple, repeated practice of coming back to yourself. Of noticing when you're adjusting out of fear. Of observing your thoughts without identifying with them. Of choosing integrity over approval. This is the path. Not easy. Not quick. Not free from doubt or struggle. But worth it. Because at the end of this path, or rather, as you walk this path, because it's not really about reaching some destination, you find what you've been searching for all along. Not approval. Not validation. Not the certainty that everyone likes you. But something better. Something more lasting. Something that doesn't fluctuate based on external opinions. You find yourself. Your real self. The one that's been there all along, beneath the performance, beneath the adjustment, beneath the constant scanning for approval. And that self, imperfect and uncertain and real, is the one worth knowing. The one worth trusting. The one worth being. Chapter 5, Living Unbothered, Not Careless. There's a common misunderstanding about what it means to stop caring what people think. It's often interpreted as indifference. As coldness. As a shutting down of empathy or concern for others. But that's not what this is about. Living unbothered is not the same as living careless. And the distinction between the two matters more than you might realize. Because if you confuse the two, you'll either remain trapped in the pattern of seeking approval, or you'll swing too far in the opposite direction and isolate yourself emotionally from the people around you. Neither extreme serves you. Neither one leads to the kind of grounded, peaceful existence that you're working toward. So it's worth taking time to understand what living unbothered actually means. And perhaps more importantly, what it doesn't mean. Living unbothered doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It doesn't mean you become indifferent to their feelings or dismissive of their perspectives. It doesn't mean you shut down your capacity for empathy or connection. It means you stop letting their opinions of you dictate your sense of worth. You stop collapsing under their judgment. You stop abandoning yourself to gain their approval. But you can do all of that while still caring about them as people. While still considering their feelings. While still maintaining meaningful relationships. The difference is in where your center of gravity lies. When you're dependent on external approval, your center of gravity is outside of you. It's in their reactions, their opinions, their validation. And because it's outside of you, you're constantly off balance. Constantly adjusting. Constantly trying to stabilize yourself by managing how they perceive you. But when you're living unbothered, your center of gravity is within you. It's in your values, your integrity, your sense of who you are. And because it's within you, you're stable. You're grounded. You're able to engage with the world without being destabilized by every shift in opinion or every moment of judgment. This doesn't mean you're rigid. It doesn't mean you never adjust or compromise. It doesn't mean you're unwilling to consider feedback or learn from others. It just means you're doing all of those things from a place of choice rather than fear. From a place of strength rather than desperation. From a place of centeredness rather than constant reactivity. And that distinction between choice and fear, between strength and desperation, between centeredness and reactivity, is everything. Because when you're acting from fear, even your kindness is transactional. Even your consideration is strategic. Even your care for others is mixed with the need to be seen in a certain way. But when you're acting from centeredness, your kindness is genuine. Your consideration is authentic. Your care for others is uncomplicated by the need for approval. And people can feel the difference. They may not consciously recognize it, but they sense it. They sense when your actions are coming from a place of groundedness rather than a place of need. And paradoxically, this often deepens your relationships. Not because you're trying to deepen them, but because authenticity creates space for real connection in a way that performance never can. So living unbothered is not about becoming cold or detached. It's about becoming grounded. It's about establishing a stable internal foundation that doesn't require constant external validation to remain intact. And from that foundation, you can engage with the world in a healthier way. A way that doesn't exhaust you. A way that doesn't require you to constantly monitor and adjust and perform. This healthier engagement begins with understanding that you can care about people without taking responsibility for their opinions of you. You can consider their perspective without needing them to approve of yours. You can value their input without letting it override your own judgment. You can be affected by their feelings without being controlled by them. This is what it means to have a healthy relationship with the external world. Not detachment. Not indifference. But appropriate boundaries. Boundaries that allow you to remain connected while also remaining yourself. Boundaries that allow you to care without losing your center. Boundaries that allow you to engage without abandoning your sense of self in the process. And these boundaries are not walls. They're not about shutting people out or protecting yourself from all influence. They're about maintaining clarity on where you end and others begin. About recognizing that their emotions are theirs to manage, not yours to fix. That their opinions are theirs to hold, not yours to control. That their judgments are theirs to carry, not yours to internalize. This clarity creates freedom. Not the freedom to be careless or inconsiderate. but the freedom to be yourself without constantly adjusting to fit what others want. The freedom to speak honestly without needing everyone to agree. The freedom to make choices that align with your values even when those choices aren't popular. The freedom to simply be, without the exhausting effort of constant performance. And as you settle into this freedom, you begin to notice something. You begin to notice that you're less reactive. Before, someone's criticism would send you spiraling. Someone's disapproval would trigger immediate self-doubt. Someone's judgment would destabilize your entire sense of self. But now, there's space. There's a pause between their reaction and your response. They criticize you, and instead of immediately defending or collapsing, you can simply observe. You can notice the criticism. You can consider whether there's truth in it. You can decide how to respond, if at all. But you're not knocked off balance. You're not thrown into chaos. You're not immediately pulled into the familiar pattern of adjusting and explaining and trying to win back their approval. You're centered. You're grounded. You're able to remain stable even when the external environment is shifting. This capacity to remain centered is perhaps the most valuable skill you can develop. Because life will always present challenges. People will always have opinions. Judgment will always exist. But if you can remain centered in the midst of all that, if you can stay grounded in your own sense of self regardless of what's happening around you, then you're truly free. Not free from challenge. Not free from discomfort. But free from being controlled by it. And this freedom comes from practice. From the repeated experience of noticing when you're being pulled off center and consciously choosing to return to it. Someone says something critical, and you feel the pull. The familiar tug toward defensiveness, toward explanation, toward adjustment. But instead of following that pull, you pause. You breathe. You remind yourself that their opinion, while you might consider it, doesn't define you. And you return to center. Not by forcing anything. Not by suppressing your feelings. But by simply redirecting your attention back to your own sense of what's true. This practice, repeated over time, becomes your new baseline. It becomes the way you naturally respond to external judgment. Not with reactivity, but with groundedness. Not with defensiveness, but with clarity. Not with collapse, but with stability. And as this becomes your baseline, you begin to notice another shift. You begin to notice that other people's thoughts about you don't carry the weight they once did. Not because you've convinced yourself not to care. Not because you've built walls to protect yourself. But because you've internalized something fundamental, their thoughts about you are not the truth about you. They're just thoughts. Filtered through their own experiences, their own biases, their own limitations. Filtered through factors that have nothing to do with who you actually are. And while their thoughts might contain useful information, while they might point to something worth considering, they're not the ultimate authority on your worth or your identity. You are. Not in an arrogant way. Not in a way that dismisses all feedback or refuses to learn from others. But in a grounded way. In a way that recognizes that you're the only one who truly knows your intentions, your context, your full story. You're the only one who's lived your entire life. Who's experienced every moment that's shaped you. Who's navigated every challenge you faced. So while others can offer perspective, while they can point out blind spots, while they can provide valuable input, they can't define you. They don't have the full picture. They never will. And once you truly internalize this, once it becomes more than just an intellectual understanding, something profound shifts. You stop needing their approval to feel okay about yourself. You stop interpreting their judgment as evidence of your inadequacy. You stop giving their opinions more weight than your own lived experience. And in that shift, you reclaim something essential. You reclaim your sense of self. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. But the real version. The one that exists independent of external validation. This is what it means to live unbothered. Not careless. Not indifferent. Not detached. but grounded, centered, clear about who you are and unwilling to abandon that clarity for the sake of approval. And from this place, you can engage with the world in a way that's both connected and boundaried, both caring and self-preserving, both open and discerning. You can listen to feedback without collapsing under it. You can consider criticism without internalizing it. You can care about people without needing them to validate you. And this balance, between connection and boundaries, between caring and centeredness, between openness and discernment, is what creates a sustainable way of being. Because the extremes don't work. Complete dependence on external approval is exhausting and unsustainable. Complete detachment from others is isolating and ultimately unfulfilling. But this middle path, grounded in yourself while remaining connected to others, this is where peace lives. Not the absence of challenge. Not the absence of judgment. But the presence of stability. The presence of clarity. The presence of a self that doesn't need constant validation to remain intact. And as you walk this path, as you continue to practice returning to center, you begin to notice how often you used to be pulled off balance. How much energy you used to spend managing perception. How exhausting it was to constantly scan for approval or disapproval. And you realize you don't want to go back to that. You don't want to return to the constant vigilance, the endless adjustment, the exhausting performance. Not because it's wrong or bad, but because you've tasted something better. You've experienced what it's like to be grounded, to be centered, to simply be yourself without the constant effort of managing how it's received. And once you've tasted that freedom, it's hard to settle for anything less. So you keep practicing. You keep noticing when you're being pulled off center. You keep choosing to return to your own sense of what's true. And over time, this becomes less of a conscious practice and more of a natural way of being. It becomes who you are. Not someone who doesn't care, but someone who's unbothered. Someone who's grounded. Someone who can engage with the world without losing themselves in it. This is the goal. Not some distant achievement, but a lived reality that you're building, moment by moment, choice by choice, through the simple practice of remaining centered in who you are, regardless of what others think. And in that centeredness, you find what you've been searching for. Not approval. Not validation. Not the certainty that everyone likes you. But something better. Something more lasting. Something that doesn't depend on external circumstances. You find peace. You find stability. You find yourself. And that, more than anything else, is worth the work. And as this centeredness becomes more established, you begin to notice patterns you couldn't see before. Patterns in how you used to interpret the world. Patterns in how you used to assign meaning to other people's behavior. Someone would be quiet during a conversation, and you would immediately assume it meant they were judging you. Someone would disagree with your opinion, and you would interpret it as personal rejection. Someone would seem distant, and you would conclude you had done something wrong. These interpretations happened automatically, without conscious thought, without questioning whether they were accurate. But now, with the distance that centeredness provides, you can see these interpretations for what they are: assumptions. Not facts. Not truths. Just one possible explanation among many. Someone is quiet during a conversation. Before, you would have spiraled into worry about what they were thinking. Now, you can recognize that their silence might have nothing to do with you. They might be tired. They might be processing. They might simply be comfortable with quiet. Someone disagrees with your opinion. Before, you would have felt rejected, defensive, threatened. Now, you can recognize that disagreement is just disagreement. It's not personal rejection. It's not evidence that you're wrong or inadequate. It's just a different perspective. Someone seems distant. Before, you would have immediately assumed you were the cause and spent hours analyzing what you might have done wrong. Now, you can recognize that people have their own inner worlds, their own struggles, their own reasons for being distant that have nothing to do with you. This shift in interpretation changes everything. Because so much of the pain you experienced around judgment wasn't actually caused by the judgment itself. It was caused by the meaning you assigned to it. The judgment was just information. Someone had a thought. Someone had an opinion. Someone formed an impression. But you took that information and turned it into a story. A story about your inadequacy. A story about your failure. A story about how you're not enough. And then you lived inside that story. You believed it. You let it shape how you saw yourself. You let it determine your worth. But the story was never true. It was just an interpretation. A meaning you assigned based on old beliefs, old fears, old patterns. And now, you're learning to question those stories. To challenge those interpretations. To recognize that there are other ways of understanding what's happening. This doesn't mean you ignore genuine feedback. It doesn't mean you dismiss all criticism. It doesn't mean you refuse to learn from others. It just means you stop automatically accepting the most negative interpretation. You stop assuming the worst. You stop turning every moment of judgment into evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. Instead, you pause. You question. You consider other possibilities. And in that pause, you create space for a different kind of response. Not reactive. Not defensive. Not collapsed. But thoughtful. Grounded. Clear. This capacity to pause, to question, to consider, this is what allows you to remain unbothered. Not because nothing affects you, but because you're no longer immediately swept away by every interpretation your mind generates. You can observe the interpretation. You can recognize it as one possibility among many. And you can choose whether to believe it or to consider alternatives. This practice of questioning your interpretations extends beyond how you understand other people's judgments. It also applies to how you understand your own thoughts about yourself. Because often, the harshest judgments don't come from others. They come from within. From the voice that tells you you're not doing enough. That you should be further along. That everyone else has it figured out and you're falling behind. This internal voice can be relentless. And for a long time, you may have believed it was helping you. Motivating you. Keeping you accountable. But as you develop this capacity to question interpretations, you begin to see this voice differently. You begin to recognize that it's not motivating you. It's draining you. It's not keeping you accountable. It's keeping you anxious. And you begin to question it. To challenge it. To ask whether its assessments are actually accurate or whether they're just reflections of old fears and unrealistic standards. You're not doing enough. Really? By whose measure? And is that measure even reasonable? And even if you could do more, does that mean what you're doing now is worthless? You should be further along. Further along than what? Than whom? And who decided what the timeline should be? And is this comparison even useful, or is it just making you miserable? Everyone else has it figured out. Do they? Or are you just seeing their external presentation and assuming it reflects their internal reality? And even if they do have some things figured out that you don't, does that mean you're failing? These questions dismantle the automatic authority of the internal critic. They reveal it as just another voice. Another interpretation. Another story that you don't have to believe just because it appears in your mind. And as you practice this questioning, as you refuse to automatically accept every negative thought as truth, something begins to shift. The internal critic becomes quieter. Not gone, but less dominant. Less convincing. Less able to destabilize you with a single thought. And in the space that opens up, other voices can emerge. Kinder voices. More accurate voices. Voices that recognize your efforts, acknowledge your growth, appreciate your progress. Not in some artificial, forced positivity way. but in a realistic, grounded way. In a way that sees you clearly, including your imperfections, and still finds you worthy of respect. This internal shift, from automatic self-criticism to thoughtful self-assessment, parallels the external shift you've been making. From automatic acceptance of others' judgments to thoughtful consideration of whether those judgments are accurate or useful. In both cases, you're reclaiming your authority. You're deciding what you believe rather than passively accepting whatever interpretation first appears. And this is not easy. It requires constant practice, constant awareness, constant choosing. Because the old patterns are deeply ingrained. The automatic interpretations happen faster than conscious thought. The familiar stories feel true because they've been repeated so many times. But each time you pause, each time you question, each time you choose a more accurate interpretation over an automatic negative one, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen the new one. And over time, the new pattern becomes stronger than the old. The pause becomes more automatic than the reactive interpretation. The questioning becomes more natural than the automatic acceptance. This is when you begin to truly live unbothered. Not because you've eliminated all negative thoughts or all external judgment, but because you've changed your relationship to them. You no longer take them at face value. You no longer let them define you. You no longer collapse under their weight. You can observe them, consider them, learn from them when appropriate, and release them when they're not serving you. And this capacity to engage with judgment without being controlled by it is what creates lasting peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone approving of you. Not the temporary peace that comes from avoiding all conflict. But the stable peace that comes from being grounded in yourself, regardless of external circumstances. This peace doesn't mean you never feel hurt by criticism. It doesn't mean you never wish people understood you better. It doesn't mean you're immune to the sting of judgment. It just means those experiences don't devastate you the way they once did. They don't send you spiraling. They don't make you question your fundamental worth. They don't pull you so far off center that you lose yourself. You can feel the hurt, acknowledge it, process it, and return to your center. You can wish for understanding without needing it to feel okay. You can notice the sting of judgment without letting it poison your sense of self. This resilience is not something you're born with. It's something you build. Through practice. Through repetition. Through the consistent choice to return to center, even when it's uncomfortable. And as you build this resilience, you begin to notice another benefit. You begin to notice that your relationships improve. Not because you're trying to improve them. Not because you found some new strategy for getting people to like you. But because you're showing up differently. You're showing up as someone who's grounded rather than desperate. Someone who's genuine rather than performing. Someone who can be present rather than constantly scanning for signs of approval or disapproval. And this groundedness, this genuineness, this presence, these qualities naturally deepen connection. They create space for real relationship. They allow others to relax around you because they can sense that you're not needing something from them. You're not needing them to validate you. You're not needing them to approve of you. You're not needing them to see you in a particular way. You're just being. And that simple act of being, unencumbered by the need for approval, is often more compelling than any performance could be. This doesn't mean everyone will appreciate it. Some people are more comfortable with performance. Some people prefer relationships where everyone is playing a role, maintaining an image, keeping things surface level. And when you stop performing, those people might become uncomfortable. They might distance themselves. They might even criticize you for changing, for not being who they expected you to be. And that's okay. Because the relationships built on performance were never sustainable anyway. They required constant maintenance. Constant adjustment. Constant suppression of who you actually are. The relationships that remain, or the new ones that form, are built on something more solid. On authenticity. On mutual respect. On the recognition that both people are allowed to be themselves without constant performance. And these relationships, while perhaps fewer in number, are deeper in quality. They're more satisfying, more nourishing, more real. Because you can actually be yourself in them. You can share what you really think without filtering it through layers of "will they approve?" You can express what you really feel without worrying about whether it's the right thing to feel. You can simply be present, and that's enough. This is what becomes possible when you live unbothered. Not a life free from judgment or challenge, but a life where judgment and challenge don't have the power to destabilize you. Where you can remain centered even when the external world is chaotic. Where you can stay grounded in who you are even when others don't understand. Where you can maintain your sense of self even when faced with criticism or disapproval. And this stability, this groundedness, this centeredness, these are not luxuries. They're necessities. Because without them, you're at the mercy of every opinion, every judgment, every shift in how you're perceived. But with them, you're free. Not free from external judgment. That's impossible. But free from being controlled by it. Free from letting it determine your worth. Free from abandoning yourself in pursuit of it. And that freedom is not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It's something you practice. Daily. Moment by moment. In small choices and large ones. In the choice to speak honestly even when it might not be well received. In the choice to set a boundary even when it disappoints someone. In the choice to honor your own needs even when others don't understand them. Each of these choices reinforces your center. Each one strengthens your sense of self. Each one reminds you that you can trust yourself, that you can stand by your values, that you don't need constant external validation to be okay. And over time, these choices accumulate into a way of being. A way of moving through the world that's both connected and boundaried. Both caring and self-preserving. Both open to others and grounded in yourself. This is the balance you've been seeking. Not the extreme of complete dependence on external approval. Not the extreme of complete detachment from others. But the middle path. The grounded path. The path of living unbothered, not careless. And as you continue on this path, you may notice moments of backsliding. Moments when someone's judgment hits harder than expected. Moments when you find yourself seeking approval again, adjusting again, performing again. And that's not failure. That's just being human. The patterns you're working with have been reinforced over years, maybe decades. They won't disappear completely. They'll resurface, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. But the difference is that now you recognize them. Now you can see them happening. Now you have the tools to respond differently. You can notice that you're seeking approval, and you can choose to redirect your attention back to your own center. You can notice that you're adjusting out of fear, and you can choose to honor your truth instead. You can notice that you're collapsing under judgment, and you can choose to question whether that judgment actually defines you. These choices, made consistently over time, are what create lasting change. Not perfection. Not the complete elimination of old patterns. But a steady shift toward groundedness, toward centeredness, toward living in a way that feels real rather than performed. And in that shift, you find what this whole journey has been about. Not approval. Not validation. Not the certainty that everyone likes you. But something far more valuable. Something that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Something that remains stable even when the world around you is shifting. You find yourself. Your real self. Not the performed version. Not the adjusted version. Not the version that's been shaped to fit what others expect. But the version that knows what it thinks, trusts what it feels, and stands by what it values. The version that can be present in the world without losing itself. The version that can care about others without abandoning itself. This version has always been there. Beneath the performance. Beneath the adjustment. Beneath the constant scanning for approval. It's been waiting, quietly, for you to remember it exists. For you to stop looking outward for validation and start looking inward for truth. For you to stop performing and start being. And now, as you continue this practice, as you keep choosing centeredness over reactivity, authenticity over performance, integrity over approval, that version becomes stronger, more present, more accessible. Until one day, you realize it's not something you're trying to access anymore. It's just who you are. Grounded. Centered. Unbothered. Not because nothing affects you, but because you've learned to remain stable in the midst of whatever does. Not because you don't care about people, but because you've learned to care without losing yourself. Not because you're immune to judgment, but because you've learned that judgment doesn't define you. This is what living unbothered looks like. And it's available to you. Not as some distant ideal, but as a lived reality that you're building, moment by moment, through the simple practice of remaining centered in who you are. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's unpopular. Even when no one else understands. Because in the end, the only understanding that truly matters is your own. The only approval that sustains you is internal. And the only life worth living is one that's actually yours. Not shaped by fear. Not dictated by others' opinions. Not performed for an audience that may not even be paying attention. But real. Honest. Grounded in who you actually are. This is the path. And you're already on it.